Coming up on the Locked On Mariners podcast, Joe Doyle tells us who the Mariners are looking at in the 2023 MLB Draft, who the team's biggest trade chips are heading into the deadline, and a whole lot more. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Mariners, your daily Seattle Mariners podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Ahoy, sailors. It is Tuesday, June 27th, 2023. This is Trident Gonzalez for the Locked On Mariners podcast here. Thank you so much for making us your first listen. Subscribe, like, and turn on alerts if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe and leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform if you like what you hear. And if you're part of the crew and rock with us every single day, let us know in the comments below. And if you want to hear from us even more, please consider signing up for our Patreon. You can now get a free 7-day trial to check out the show. The link, as well as our social accounts, is in the description of this episode. Now, the MLB draft is admittedly kind of a blind spot for me, and to a lesser degree, Colby as well. So we decided to stop fooling around and get an expert on the matter on the show today, Joe Doyle. I asked Joe about what Seattle might do with its 3 top 30 draft picks, who some mid-round sleepers are, who the team's top trade chips are, and a whole lot more. Here's what he had to say. I'm here now with Joe Doyle of Future Stars Series, on the host of the Overslot podcast on Patreon. Joe, thanks for taking the time. How's it going?
I'm good, man. Good to be back on. How are you?
Yeah, it's great to have you back on. I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. I've got a lot I want to ask you about with the Mariners, of course, but I want to first ask you about last night. LSU winning the national title. Obviously, LSU has 2 guys who could possibly go number 1 in the draft next month, but what did you think about their title run, and where do you think that program stacks up, historically speaking?
Boy, in terms of just upper tier draft prospects, I don't know if you can find a better program in the history of the sport. I'm sure I would be proven wrong if someone did the research, but the thing that really stands out for me with that LSU team is they're going to lose a lot of talent, and they have so much of it returning. They've got 2, 3, maybe 4 first-round picks that are coming back for 2024, and you better believe they're going to be involved in the transfer portal. So a truly enjoyable college baseball playoffs with the amount of talent that was able to filter its way in to that tournament. And I think culminating with, the 3 top players in college baseball in the World Series was just a real treat.
The other night, you were talking a lot about the number 1 pick. We got Dylan Cruz, we got Paul Skeens. You've even talked a lot about Max Clark. What's your feel on what the Pirates are going to do right now?
Well, whatever they choose, I don't think it's going to be full slot. Listen, the MLB draft it's an exercise in money. It always is, and it's not about being cheap. It's about being flexible with the amount of talent that you can pull in. And I just don't think with the amount of talent that's at the top of this draft, it would be smart, frankly, for any team to pay anyone full freight. So I think it's going to be some sort of negotiating 4 players against each other: Cruz, Langford, Skeens, and Clark, and whoever they feel is the best combination of both talent and savings is probably going to be that pick. We haven't heard anything about Langford yet, but I do tend to think that with the College World Series behind us, and he wasn't at the Combine, I have a feeling we're going to at least get some helium toward a Wyatt Langford for $8.5 million at number 1. Could it happen? I think those days are approaching.
You mentioned the Combine. You were at the Combine, right?
Just for the last day. Yeah.
Last day. Was there anyone that stood out to you on that last day?
Honestly, I was only in Chase Field for about an hour and a half. Most of my time down there was spent meeting with people in the industry, making introductions and networking. But just seeing Michael Graziano in person, he's 6'6" outfielder. I mean, you kind of get these kids, and they are kids, just like standing next to one another, and you realize like some of these guys are not they're not human. They're not built like the other players on the field. So he really stood out.
We got a question in our mailbag yesterday from Josh asking what the Mariners will emphasize in this draft. So I'll ask you the same thing. What do you think Scott Hunter, Jerry DiPoto, and crew will specifically want to come away from this draft with when it's all said and done?
It's a good question. I tend to think that Seattle is going to go the route that they've gone every single draft, and that's I know it's a cliche answer and it doesn't answer much, but they're going to try to walk away with the most amount of talent they possibly can with the picks that they have. Scott Hunter and Jerry DiPoto have never struck me as the type of guys that are going to drag a player down and overpay him at 22, and nor do I think they're going to seriously overpay anyone at 29 or 30. So I think if you're Scott Hunter and Jerry DiPoto, you want to walk away with, with those 4 top 60 picks with probably 4 guys that are going to slot inside of your top 12 prospects in the organization. In terms of an emphasis, they are going to continue to stay up the middle of the field. High school shortstops and pitching would be my guess.
In your latest mock draft on Future Star Series, you have the Mariners going prep bat twice with Colt Emerson at 22, Walker Martin at 29, and then a college bat with Brock Wilken at 30. So, tell us about a bit about those guys, why you like them for Seattle, and who are some other names you've heard at those spots.
Yeah, Colt Emerson is just an 80 grade human being. First of all, he's going to fit a lot of draft models. He's barely 18 years old, a little bit like Cole Young, but with more impact in the bat. Can really hit. I would say he was the second best high school hitter in the entire country last year by numbers standards, behind just Aiden Miller. Probably shifts to third base, where he's going to be plenty suitable and plenty powerful enough to play that position, and just kind of one of those happy-go-lucky, humble Cole Young types, just kind of gentle and soft-spoken. Brock Wilken is just a man among boys. I mean, I think he's a little bit too passive at the plate, and he's a really big body, so there are questions as to whether or not he's going to play third base. He's a better defender than what Tyler Locklear was at this time last year, so I would give him a better chance of actually staying at third base. And then I'm trying to remember the third guy I mocked at 29. Who was that?
Walker Martin.
Walker Martin's a freak.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it at that. 6'5", 205, 208 pounds. I've heard comps of Michael Saunders, and I think it's fair. Plays shortstop now, plays a little bit of third base. I think he led the entire country in home runs. Granted, it was in Colorado, so he didn't see some of the pitching that the guys in Texas and Florida and some of those states did, but just a physical freak, could end up in center field, can really run, has a lot of power. And I think that's, if you're calling Emerson the safer play, high floor, high ceiling play, and you're calling Wilken the college bat that should move pretty quick, Walker Martin would be that, okay, this guy's the outlier, unicorn.
More from my conversation with Joe Doyle in just a moment, but first, a reminder, this episode of the Locked On Mariners podcast is brought to you by eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. Now, that's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head on over to eBay Motors. With the eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. And you're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Thank you again for making us your first listen. A reminder, you can catch the Mariners and the Nationals Game 2 of that series on the Mariners hometown broadcast with SiriusXM via the SXM app. All right, let's get back into my conversation with Joe. Another guy that Colby and I have talked about a lot on our Patreon show is Bryce Matthews, who you have going one pick ahead of the Martin pick to the Astros in your mock rather. You did mention Matthews for the Mariners though in your write up for number 29. What do you think about that fit?
I think if I'm being honest, I think Matthews is probably the pipe dream at 57 for the team. And the reason I say that is he's kind of he's the rare college hitter with a kind of a low floor. Like, he doesn't have fantastic bat to ball skills, but just one of those guys that's incredibly twitchy, plays a really fantastic shortstop, can play anywhere on the field. No doubt about it. He could play anywhere on the diamond, but isn't as proven a college bat as some of the other guys. And so I think when you're drafting a college player in the first round, especially Seattle, would want that peace of mind of, this guy's going to produce. He's going to be a big leaguer. And I'm not sure Bryce Matthews has shown the safety of going at 29. Now, if he's there at 57, which I don't think he will be, I think it's a slam dunk pick. But man, talk about the twitchy hips, the explosive hands of Mookie Betts. Obviously not the performer of Mookie Betts, but some of the same movement patterns. Sure. That's kind of the athlete that you dream on, and you kind of hope it all clicks.
I also am really intrigued by his teammate, Max Anderson. What do you think about Anderson compared to someone like Brock Wilken?
Yeah, so I personally think Max Anderson is the third most complete polished hitter in this class, behind Wyatt Langford and behind Dylan Cruz. He's got a fantastic track record with the numbers, both against breaking balls, both against big velo, against pitches in the zone, and making contact on pitches out of the zone. He is a bit of a boxy kid, like it's probably going to be third base, and I don't think he's going to be the most powerful guy in the world, but you kind of dream on a kid that hits, maybe 275 with 18 home runs and plays a fringy third base. So not a ton of dynamic upside in terms of the athlete and where he could play on the field, but the kid can really, really hit.
We haven't talked a lot about pitchers here, and that's obviously for good reason. This isn't a good draft class for pitchers, but if maybe the Mariners go against the grain here and draft a pitcher high, who are some guys to maybe keep an eye on?
Well, I think if they draft a pitcher high in the first round, it's going to be a high schooler. I would have to imagine
Mhm.
it's going to be someone like an Alex Clemmie, someone that's really young, that throws really hard, that they don't grow on trees types. Maybe a Liam Peterson or a Josh Noth, those types of guys. I think Seattle probably enters the college pitching market closer to the third round. There's a chance that they fall in love with a guy like Jackson Baumeister in the second round, but I don't see it. I think the third, fourth, and fifth round is where you kind of start seeing Seattle dip their toes into that market. Guys that make sense. I think Alonzo Treadwell at UCLA. He's a 6'7" 230 pounder that absolutely pounds the strike zone. It's a buttery operation. Doesn't walk anybody. He's got a 3-pitch mix. I don't think it's enormous upside, but when you're talking about a 6'7" righty with prospect pedigree, maybe they think that they can unlock something in there and have him throwing 94, 95, 96 in due time. There's a bunch of other guys in that range that I think
Mhm.
makes sense for the team. Seth Keener out of Wake Forest, I think, is a really interesting player. Andrew Walters out of Miami is a really interesting player, but I don't think for the casual draft fan, you're going to hear a college pitcher called until the third round. But I could be wrong.
So I saw you tweet maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks ago that there just really isn't a unicorn of a pitcher in this draft class, like a Bryce Miller, right? Is Clemmy probably the closest guy to that?
That has a chance to start, yes. Like the unicorn in this draft is Andrew Walters, the closer out of
Okay.
Miami. It's the low slot, it's the riding fastball, it's the up to 99 with the big slider. He doesn't really have a third pitch, and there's some command issues there. But honestly, if I were Seattle and he was there in the third round, I would draft him and just see if you can start him. It's really, really unique stuff. I'll tell you another name to keep an eye on that I think Seattle would be interested in. Kid by the name of Jake Peppers. He's a
Mm.
right-handed pitcher out of Jacksonville State. He does have that low release, not as much carry on the fastball, but another mid-80s slider, kind of what you've seen with Bryce Miller and Brian Wu. The interesting thing with Peppers is it's been above average carry for most of the year at Jacksonville State, but he's gotten onto the Cape now, and it's been just enormous plus carry. And I think some of that goes back to his academy training before he got on the Cape. So that would be a name, maybe a sleeper name in the third round, third or fourth round, that Jake Peppers, Jacksonville State, to keep an eye on.
You already talked about this a little bit, and you already kind of answered the question that I'm going to ask, but I do want to dive a little bit deeper into this because I do think that it's a really interesting element for the Mariners this year because they have such a rare and unique opportunity with all that extra bonus pool money that they're getting from picks 29 and 30. Um, First, with getting the two prep bats in your mock, what would that cost them? And then how likely do you think in general is it that they get at least a little bit aggressive with their money in the first round or later on?
So I think you could take any one of those high schoolers in the first round for slot. I think Colt Emerson would
Okay.
be full slot, Alex Clemmie full slot. I think most of the guys that you would hear in the first round would be full slot. If Aiden Miller were to fall down to 22 for some reason, I think he would be a really exciting pick for the team. That's a guy that had top 10 upside and then just broke his hamate bone this year, and he wasn't able to hit for much of the year, but he's impressed in private workouts. So if they were to stretch their budget, I'm not sure what player it would require them to overpay. Maybe a Blake Mitchell requires a little bit more money than what you can pay at 22 if he's there. Um, but I think most of the guys that you're hearing about, they want to sign, and so Colt Emerson, Colin Houck, Walker Martin, Sammy Stafura, maybe all those guys would be even slot. There's a couple, maybe a Bryce Eldridge would cost a couple $100,000 over slot to get on campus, but for the most part, I don't think they'd have to stretch their budget unless they
You
actively voluntarily tried to drag someone down.
gotcha. You mentioned a little while ago, a lot of pitchers, but overall, any mid-round sleepers you think could land with Seattle? And heard any rumblings about guys that they might like in that range?
The two guys that really stand out, the one that I have my eyes on is Alejandro Rosario out of Miami. We're talking about a kid that was on campus for 3 years with the Hurricanes. I don't know if he posted an ERA under 7. He got beat up. Fantastic changeup. I've tweeted about him before if you want to go look up the tweets, but
Mhm.
fantastic changeup, fantastic slider, and a sinking fastball that just got absolutely annihilated, like 95 to 98. So I think he's the perfect guy that you bring into the organization, take the Matt Brash approach and say, we're done throwing this fastball. It's a bad fastball. Stop throwing it. Stop it. Start throwing the changeup, start throwing the slider. We'll get guys out at the top of the zone with the sinker toward the 1 and 2, 0 and 2 counts. That's a name in the 4th round though that I would be circling, maybe the 3rd round. Alejandro Rosario, probably not a starter, but could be in the bullpen next year.
Before we move on here, I want to ask you just in general, like outside of what's going on with the Mariners, outside of what's going on with the number 1 pick, is there a player out there or just a storyline in general that you're really interested to see play out in the draft?
That's a good question. I think the one that I'm most interested in is Hurston Waldrop. There's 2 of them. So Hurston Waldrop is a guy that every pitching analyst will say, this guy's stuff is unbelievable. Like, why is he getting hit as hard as he's getting hit? I want, and he didn't have a good College World Series either. Yeah, I think he pitched 2 innings. I wonder if he can sneak into like the top 12 or if he actually falls out of like the top 20. And then the other one is Jacob Wilson. Jacob Wilson has been a guy that's been slammed onto boards, in the top 10 throughout the year. As we get here closer to the draft, everyone's saying, I don't know if this guy can hit the ball very hard and make enough impact to outweigh some of these other guys that are on the board. So I think at this time of the year, I'm not really looking for the guys that are going to jump way up the board, but more like who are going to be the guys that are going to be available later in the draft that nobody really expected.
You're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Joe Doyle is here with us talking about the MLB draft. But Joe, I actually want to switch gears and ask you a bit about this Mariners farm before I let you go. If this team ends up buying something at the deadline, which I think that they're going to do, even if they're still pretty much in the same situation that they are right now, who do you think are their most valuable trade chips?
Ooh, good question. Their most valuable trade chips. I mean, right now, I would say there's nobody with a higher stock than Michael Arroyo.
Mhm.
He's in
I want
Modesto
to
right
ask you
now.
about him later on. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would think that if you're really looking to go get a chip, a controllable multi-year guy, Michael Arroyo is going to be a pretty high ask for a lot of teams. And that's not including the Brian Woos and, the top 3 guys. But I think Michael Arroyo is a guy that really stands out. I think there are going to be teams that are really interested in Lazaro Montez. He's been pretty good this year. And then
Mhm.
if you really wanted a couple of deep cuts, Carlos Jimenez, the center fielder, I don't even think he's in Modesto yet, and Darren Bowen in Modesto. Those 2 guys have a lot of helium right now, and I think those are going to be popular asks.
So you mentioned Arroyo. He's been just a hell of a lot of fun to watch down in Modesto right now. We knew going into this that it was an advanced hit tool, but to see him doing what he's doing at 18 years old is just so incredibly impressive. What's been your overall assessment of him so far?
Wow. Like
Yeah.
it's been wild. The fact that I think one of the things that is most surprising to me isn't actually the bat. It's that the team thinks high enough of Michael Arroyo to move Cole Young to second base on occasion to keep him getting reps at the 6. I think that speaks volumes toward the team at least thinking he has an outside shot of playing that position, at least in a part-time role. And that's really surprising to me. I always kind of felt like he was going to hit. I didn't think he was going to hit like this, nor did I think he was going to hit for this much power stateside in full season ball. But the whole package has been at 18 years old has been more impressive than what Gabriel Gonzalez did last year. And yeah, I mean, this organization has a lot of very, very talented young hitters in that 18 to 20-year-old age bracket right now. And Arroyo, frankly, might be the best of the bunch.
Do you think Everett could be a possibility for him before the year is over? I know it sounds aggressive, but he also looks maybe too good for low A right now. So
Well, I look at it this way. I mean, if Seattle goes into this draft and they draft a middle infielder, specifically a college middle infielder in the first 5 rounds, you've got to make space for him. Now,
mm,
obviously, everyone's going to say, well, Cole Young is definitely moving up to Everett. And I think that would probably be what makes the most sense. Um, and moving an 18-year-old like Arroyo up to play the middle infield at Everett at this age with the amount of at-bats he has in Modesto, probably unlikely. But I mean, sheesh, like if he hits like this for the next 6 weeks, I don't know how you can't give him a cup of coffee at the end of the year just to expose him to Everett.
right, right. Because I think it would be safe to assume that he's going to start the year there, assuming he's still with the organization, like next year.
I would think so. I mean, as long as he doesn't have a hiccup the rest of the way, he's got what we got July. He's got 9, 10 more weeks in Modesto. He could
Yeah.
play his way into Everett for opening day next year.
So you mentioned Jimenez, you mentioned Bowen, who of course we had on the show last week. Wonderful chat with him. Great kid, and been enjoying what I've seen out of him so far. Are there any other Mariners prospects that might be flying under the radar right now that have raised their stock this year?
Well, Brandon Schaefer is looking like the steal of the
Hmm.
2022 draft. The fact that he is still starting is really pretty impressive. I'm interested to see what Brandon Schaefer is going to look like as he moves up the ladder because the stuff isn't overwhelming, but it's a really weird look, and I think he's the type of guy that just carves out like an 8-year career at the next level. With 3 pitches, a slider, a changeup, and a fastball, he'd probably be the guy that really stands out for me. Besides that, if you go down the list a little bit, I know it's a guy that we've talked about for a couple years now, but Dylan Wilson looks like he's put on a lot of good weight. Curveball's added a little bit of velocity, and I think he has actually switched him and Jeter Martinez. I think both of them have started throwing a four-seam fastball with more conviction. Jeter Martinez as an amateur was all sinker, all two-seamer. And the clips that I've seen, I haven't seen any data, but the clips that I've seen sure seem to suggest that Martinez is throwing that 93 to 94 mile an hour fastball with carry through the zone. And I think that really changes kind of his outlook. So both of those two kids have had great early returns.
I think the last time we had you on the show, you actually mentioned Jeter Martinez because I think it was right before he signed or maybe right after he signed. I remember you being pretty intrigued by him, but to hear that, that's something. So definitely
Yeah.
want to keep an eye on him. Jonathan Clase has put up some big numbers this year, but I was still surprised to see him make the futures game. What have you thought about his year so far?
I was surprised to see him make the futures game too. I think baseball is really playing into the fact that Jonathan Clase is just a 90 grade human being. Everyone
Mm,
likes him within the organization. He's one of the hardest workers in the organization. He's putting up Bugs Bunny like baseball card numbers. I mean, as you dive into the swing decisions and you dive into the strikeouts, there's obviously some pretty considerable warts that he's going to have to get over should he want to carve out a full-time role. But at worst, he looks like a fourth outfielder, probably more of a corner guy. The raw power is real. The speed is real. I have a hard time right now. I'm not going to bury Class A, of course, but I have a hard time seeing him carve out a full-time role as he's currently constructed. I mean, he's not too much different than Taylor Trammell. He's just 6 inches smaller. But the tool set is kind of the same. So we'll see. He's very young. I will say the clock is ticking because he's already on the 40 man. That kind of does
mm.
put passive pressure on him making his debut because he is occupying a spot someone else could be taking. But the tools are loud, and he's a good guy. He's a good person. So easy to root for.
Yesterday during our mailbag episode, we were also asked about maybe some other guys down in Tacoma because right now, I mean, this team is scrambling for options, offensively and specifically on the bench, with how little they're using their bench right now. Is there anyone in Tacoma? Because for me, I look at Tacoma now and I think you're out of shots to take, or
Yeah.
pretty much just about there. But is there anyone in Tacoma that you're even mildly intrigued by, that someone to maybe give an opportunity at the big league level for, I don't know, a week or two?
If the offense folds, let's say if there's a couple of injuries, I think Jake Shiner is probably a guy that you need to at least call and see if it works. I mean, we've seen guys with slow bats. And when I say slow bat, I don't mean that there's no power. There's power.
Mhm.
The swing gets going slowly. And so catching up to supreme velocity for those types of guys can be very difficult. But it's the type of guy that you really do need to kind of give a shot to, right? He's, what is he, 26,
27.
first base. Yeah,
Yeah.
27, first base, third base. Like, if you need another DH or Eugenio Suarez gets hurt or Ty France gets hurt, he's probably a guy that you give a shot to. Um, and you just see if you kind of take the Mike Ford approach. You see if the raw power plays at the highest level, and then he's a DFA candidate at the end of the year.
Yeah.
And then the other one, Mason McCoy is a good glove. He's an interesting little player. I don't think he's anything that you write home about, but certainly fills a spot if JP were to get hurt over an extended period of time.
Well, yeah, right now, I look at Dylan Moore and this isn't, this isn't criticism of Dylan Moore specifically. The guy missed pretty much all of his offseason work. He missed all of spring training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've gone over this time and time again on the show, but it doesn't seem like it's fair to just continue to, ride him and force the situation, because I see him right now and I see a guy that's not capable of hitting major league pitching right now. And so I don't know. I guess McCoy makes some sense there. This team, if they're going to try to make this thing work this year, they're going to have to retool that bench in a pretty substantial way, I think. And but in the interim right now, because who knows who's trying to trade at the moment, I don't know anyone in Tacoma really that I'm willing to take a shot on. Shiner, sure, but again, you mentioned the bat speed issues, so I don't know if that's actually going to work out for you at all. I assume you're going to the Futures game, right?
I am. Yep.
Yeah. So who outside of Harry Ford and Jonathan Clase are you excited to see?
I'm pumped to see Jackson Holiday.
Mm,
The kid is such a freak. The cool thing is, because I've been doing the whole draft thing for 4 or 5 years now, and I have the running series of interviewing these players before they're drafted. I've talked to a lot of these guys before. I've seen them come up through their journey, and so seeing them again in person and congratulating them on getting to where they're at, and just seeing where their games have blossomed. I think it's really interesting to see how some of these guys have just turned themselves into premium prospects when I not necessarily thought they were going to be. So Jackson Holiday's near the top of the list. Marcelo Meyer and Jordan Lawler are both really good, nice guys.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see both of them. But yeah, and Spencer Jones, I just like to see his BP. We'll see what Spencer Jones maybe puts some off the windows. So yeah, there's just some really cool talent that's going to be up.
It's gonna be fun. Are you going to? I assume you're going to the draft as well. Are you going to any of the other All-Star events?
Yep, I'll be at the high school All-American game, because
Nice.
that's kind of my bread and butter, of course. And then I'll be at the Derby. I'll be at the All-Star game. I think I'm just going to take in the Derby and the All-Star game as a fan, but I'll be media for the other 3 events.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you for hopping on. It's always a pleasure. Tell us what you got cooking up these next few weeks and where we can find it all.
Yeah, man. So Overslot, the MLB Draft Podcast, over on my Patreon, if you're interested in getting rumors and previews and maybe news that isn't being published out there on teams that are being connected to certain guys, feel free to subscribe to that. And then, of course, you can find all my work at Future Star Series Plus, where I'm going to be pushing out a final top 616 board and a couple more mocks before the end of the year.
Thank you again to Joe Doyle for hopping on and talking draft and Mariners farm with us today. Again, a reminder, you can catch Game 2 of the Mariners National Series tonight on the Mariners hometown broadcast with SiriusXM via the SXM app. That's going to do it for our show. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. I've been your host, Trident Gonzalez. Be sure to give us a follow on Twitter at LO_Mariners. You can follow me at Dane Gonzalez. That's DaneGNZLZ. And my co-host Colby at CPAT11. That's CPAT11. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok as well over at Locked On Mariners. That's one word, Locked On Mariners. You can also find all that stuff in the description of this episode. And thank you again for making us your first listen. Have yourself a beautiful baseball day. We'll see you tomorrow. Peace.